Okay, so as you see, this presentation is going to be dealing with the resources which are required from the photovoltaic industry in order to reach a critical scale. And of course, as we're dealing with long-term scenarios, we are necessarily dealing with guesswork. So there will be a lot of imprecision, but I think what is really interesting here is to pinpoint the order of magnitude of the size of the investment which we will need until PV reaches maturity, to see whether these numbers look reasonable and if there are bottlenecks in order to get there. Very shortly, let me bother you with a small disclaimer. Essentially what I'm saying is this is all personal opinions and I'm not liable for it. And let me come then to the outline of the talk. So first of all, we try to put things in context by talking about the size and relevance of the PV industry with respect to other industries. We will look at the long-term capital needs for the industry in order to reach maturity. We will examine the public and private resources where we can source it from. And then we will look also a little bit at the short term. So what are the industry challenges to get there? And we have to spend really a couple of minutes to talk also about the macroeconomic environment. For a beginning, I'll show a graph that actually you must have seen in nearly any type of version. This is one from Perez et al. And basically it's a diagram which is showing the potential of solar energy. So we all know that solar is by far the most abundant energy source on Earth. On the other side, if we look at it, first of all, it's by far not a mainstream energy technology at the time being, and there's not yet an ineluctable path, meaning that we don't even know what is going to be the actual final contribution of solar energy to the energy mix in the future. So very briefly, if you look at the graph on the right, which is by contrast showing the size of the PV market compared to, for instance, the exports in fossil fuels, if we sum up coal, oil, gas, we come to figures which are in order of 2.5 trillion a year. If we're looking at the size of the PV market, it's something like 82 billion. It's already a factor of 30. Now, normalize it for energy output, so in terms of kilowatt hour, normalize it for the fact that at the moment the size of the industry is also fueled by the fact that the costs are higher, a factor of 3. We come down to a figure which is, well, nearly 1,000 times less, and then PV is really dwarfed. Another way to look at it, to put things in context, is actually to look in the market capitalization of the industries. This is actually an indicator that the financial sector is using a lot. So on the right, you see the top 10 PV companies going from First Solar down to SunPower Corporation. I know there is a lot of volatilities in the indicators, but, well, the final picture doesn't change. So if we sum the top 10, we have a capitalization of 33 billions. If we look at the total sector market capitalization, it's 45 billions. This is a sizable figure, but I mean, just to make another example, Apple is about 4 to 5 times that. If we take the top 10 oil and gas companies, well, first of all, they're all within the top 100 world company worldwide. PV companies don't even make it to the FT 500 index. The total market capitalization is in the order of 2 trillions, and sorry, that's the top 10 only, and the total sector market capitalization, when we include the value chain, goes to 4 billions and above, 4 trillions and above. So PV, it's a sizable niche. And if you look at these figures, you may understand why, if you're talking to conventional investors, to the large conglomerates, PV for many of them is still under the radar. They're looking at it, but it's not something where they make their day-to-day decisions. So if we are talking about the long-term future, we have to see what will happen when PV actually reach critical mass. It's, as I said, very difficult to make this sort of speculations. But I mean, top-down, if we want to reach critical size, we will have to produce roughly 10% shares of the electricity mix, which corresponds to something like 2 terawatt of installed capacity. You can get there if the market is increasing to something like 10, 20 times what it is today. It will take something like 15 to 20 years if you have growth rate of 20 to 30%. In analogy, revenues would actually grow only of a factor of 3 to 6 because of the cost reduction. The market size would then be 300 to 550 billions. As you see, this is comparable more or less to what we have in the revenues in the gas industry today. Now, the level of resources which are needed to match this number can be roughly estimated on the market experience so far, but this is really tentative. So let's look at it and let's try to see what we have spent the last 10 years into photovoltaics. And I try to put it here, divided also by type of investments. So we have roughly something like $8 billion which have been spent so far in venture capital and private equity, so early stage technologies. 20 billions have been raised on the public markets. We have about 15 billions in transactions in the mergers and acquisition field. The largest chunk by far obviously comes from installations, from the downstream business. So as far as we're talking about really large projects, which are the ones which are interesting corporates and larger funds, this is about 50 billions. If we include the residential system, we come to a whopping 160 billion figures to date. What is also very important in this cake is the corporate debt, which totals 45 billions. I think there's a couple of things which is important to note and very interesting to note on the side of the regional contribution to this funding. So the first is if we're looking at US, actually the total contribution is not so large, but they're by far dominating into the early stage investment. That means the investments in technology. It should also be noted that these investments were really high in the period 2006-2008, and they further collapsed. There are more reasons for that, which we discuss later on. At the time being, actually, most of the money in venture capital and private equity is following just in follow-up rounds, so to grow this company, actually. So it's something you may think of as future technologies coming into the market. On one other thing which I think is worth noticing is, of course, the striking unbalance on asset finance. So, of course, the vast majority of it has been spent in the EU. This is because of the market. This is because of the feed-in tariffs. I mean, most of the money has been put, which has been put from the EU into PV, proportionally goes, of course, into financing solar plants. By contrast, if we're looking at Asia money, money coming from Asia, this is essentially public markets, M&A, and especially corporate debt, a very large chunk. So this is capital which goes on a supply side and basically in fueling the growth of the industry. Let me also note the corporate debt includes the national banks facility and loans. So actually it's also, well, a form of investment which is somewhere in between public and private, if you think. Now, let's put all of these figures together, and we come to the column on the left. So about 300 billions which have been invested so far in the solar sectors. And I would like to try to compare it to the public commitments so far. So technically, the only real public commitments so far have been in grants. Feed-in tariffs are actually paid by the public, by final consumers. But let's put all of this in one single category. So in grants, we've seen investment in the order of 10 billions in the last decade. Feed-in tariff payments to date, if I remember correctly, is in the order of 27 billions. What is important to know is also what is the net present values of the payment we have committed already, so for all installation to date. And this goes to about 220 billions. If we sum the three columns, basically come to something like 300 billion as well, slightly lower actually the private sector. I think it's important to note that because as an economic multiplier is way higher than any other of the measure which is typically taken, like, I don't know, fiscal policies, quantitative easing, which are typically in the order, or even the financialization of the economy. What falls back is something like 30% of the derivative market. So it's a very effective mechanism. However, we're talking about large numbers. What is important to note later on is also what is the net present value of the feed-in tariff we still need to pay for the future installation. So the gap in between now and the moment where we're reaching grid parity. It's quite difficult to come to a calculation here, so there is a lot of variation. Now, what I show in the graph is basically based on the idea that the market grows as a compound annual growth rate in the order of 30%, and the grid parity is actually, or well, subsidies are faded out in 2015. In that case, the figure is something like 420 billion. I mean, it will be matched by additional investment. Now we're just calculating what we need on the public side. If grid parity were only reached 10 years later, then this figure could be multiplied by a factor of 4 to 5. So let's now to put all the figures together and put things into context based on the learning, and please bear with the fact these are really rough approximation. Linear approximation is nothing which you should use for a long-term scenarios. We know there are going to be deviation from that. But as an order of magnitude, we can think that if we want to reach 10% electricity share, we may have to fuel the growth of photovoltaics with something like 2 trillion in asset finance, which will have to be spent in a range from 15 to 20 years. 1 trillion in corporate finance, somewhere also in between 15 to 20 years. And then subsidies may range from 400 billion to 2 trillion to be spent in a much longer time span, which is 25 to 30 years. Looks really large, but let's look at it by comparison. So with comparable markets in the global economy, fossil fuels export, as I said before, is in the order of 2.5 trillion a year. The world's GDP in 2010 was 74 trillion. This is relevant if you're thinking about the subsidies you need. I mean, annualize the subsidies, you come to something like 0.02, 0.04% of the total GDP. So it's not something you cannot imagine. And by comparison, direct and indirect subsidies, which are going to fossil fuels, are in the order of 550 billions a year, as calculated by the IEA in a report last year, so much more than that. Also, the projected capital needs to respond to the gap in demand between now and 2030, calculated also by the IEA, is 26 trillions. So as you see, we're talking figures which are compatible. Let's see then something about public and private resources and what we can comment on them. So from the figures I showed you before, I think public subsidies needs are large, but are in line with comparable strategic industries. For instance, the DOE in the US has projected that the subsidies that US alone will put into biofuels up to 2030 are in the order of 1 trillion. So it's not these figures that actually matters or concern me, I think. What I'm more concerned is about the short-term political agenda, which may turn against the renewable energy sources due to an increasing pressure on public finances. Well, you know there is a lot of debate, but I mean, it's not to be excluded. Regulatory framework uncertainty further on are very important for the private sectors. I mean, whenever there is uncertainties, private investment becomes binary. You simply don't make it as investments, and then you can create really discontinuity in the market. The last point is also we have to look at the net outflows and inflows of the subsidies, so related to the slide which I was saying before, what comes on the supply side, what comes on the demand side on the regional scale. Although the system as a whole may work very well, when there is an imbalance in the regional subsidies, then there may be friction and consideration which move on the political level. So these have to be addressed in one way or the other.